Okay, I'd like to bring this meeting to order. Is that, Craig, are you okay with it to start? Okay, this is a meeting of licensing for July 6th. Any declarations of conflict or pecuniary interest? I see none. Minutes of the previous meetings, item number 1. Can I have a mover and seconder for that, please? Member Marshall, Member Bonham. Any comments or questions on that? I see none. All those in favor? Carried. Presentation, Mr. Chris York for the NRPS tow rotation. Can I have a mover and seconder to receive this? Member Ganzel, Member Bonham. Mr. York, are you here? Please come on up to the podium. Just push the button. It'll go red for when you're ready to talk. We have your letter. Everyone has had a chance to read it. If you'd like to expand on it, sir, you have 10 minutes, and then we'll ask you questions, or if you're less than that, please go ahead.
Okay, well, for the record, I just wanted to mention before I read the presentation, which you already have and have all read, I'm assuming, is I wanted to make it clear that the licensing department found out that this presentation was going to be coming forward because the tow companies were not happy with it. And we felt intimidated because a certain member of the licensing department, which I'm going to remain nameless on, had advised us be very careful what we wish for because they may make a recommendation that they get rid of the rotation altogether and go with a tendering process. I must admit that I felt quite intimidated by that statement, that this is supposed to be a democratic process where we're supposed to be able to voice our concerns.
Mr. York, I'll talk to you about that after this meeting.
That's fine.
So if you want to go with your presentation, please. Thanks.
Whereas there have been recent changes to the tow rotation by the licensing department, a lot of tow companies are unhappy with the changes. I've been requested by numerous tow owners as well as drivers to make this presentation on their behalf to the board. The tow companies of the Niagara region are asking the police board to reconsider the changes made unilaterally by the licensing department to the rotation agreement. We feel the way it was previously being done was working well with the exception of very few limited issues. While the licensing board has made these changes, the owners of the tow companies do not believe they have the power or authority to make such changes without prior approval of the board. We are asking that the board order that the changes implemented by the licensing department be ordered reversed. With that being said, there was a small issue that we all agreed must be dealt with accordingly. There was no doubt at all that certain tow companies had multiple names on the rotation list, thus breaching the bylaws that had never been enforced. Licensing is well aware of who those companies are, as they are all controlled by the same party and using the exact same color scheme on their truck deliberately to confuse officers at the scene, thus allowing them to have multiple turns on the particular tow zones. We all agree this practice must stop and not be allowed and strictly enforced. There is an issue that licensing is concerned about trucks racing to another city to cover a call in another zone. We have a response time that allows for 30 minutes. While I too share these same concerns, this is not something that is ever going to be able to be taken care of by removing a company from a tow zone. This is an issue that is covered under the HTA accordingly. If a truck is unable to meet the 30-minute time frame, then officers have the option of asking dispatch to cancel that company off and use the next in line on the list, and the previous company will lose their spot on the rotation. If a driver is caught racing to a scene, they can be charged accordingly under the HTA as required. Most drivers and owners are very responsible when it comes to the driving because the insurance for a tow truck is very costly and companies will not tolerate drivers acting in this manner and they will be fired. I know this for a fact because I had one driver that was caught driving our flatbed on the shoulder of the 406, and as soon as it was notified to me, the driver was immediately released from our company. I fired him on the spot. I will not tolerate it. We asked that the previous way things were being done with regards to the rotations be reinstated, that being that a company must have a secured compound in that zone and at least one truck for that zone to be listed on it, and has been done for many years. As long as I can remember in this industry, that's all that's ever been required. Only recently have they made changes to require you to have a business in that city and an actual building. This is not acceptable when this has been a practice that's been allowed for years on end, for at least 30 to 40 years that I can remember. And I've been in this industry for quite some time myself. The next issue, dealing with the rates tow companies are permitted to charge for a police tow. The current rate is set at $225 and does not allow for extra charges for special equipment or scene cleanup. And now, as of recent, with the CRC collision reporting centers, we are being instructed to now tow the vehicles to the CRC prior to its final destination with no extra charging permitted for this. Tow companies had no input on this at all, and it was simply forced upon us with the expectation that we do this without compensation. We are therefore asking that the tow rates be increased to reflect this new request. We would also ask that the scene cleanup allow to have a modest charge in addition to the current tow rates. As Mr. Dale, you have gas stations all across the Niagara region. I don't need to tell you what the costs are for a scene cleanup if you have a fuel spill. All these chemicals have to be properly disposed of, and it's a cost to the tow companies. We have to put down Absorbol when there's fluids on the road. We have to pick up that Absorbol after the fluid's been recovered from it, and we have to dispose of it accordingly and properly because of environmental hazards. We are doing this with no compensation whatsoever at a cost to the company. This needs to be changed. It's not fair to the companies that we're expected to do this. We're dealing with environmentally hazardous material that technically the companies aren't even qualified to be touching. The fire department's not qualified to touch it. Tow companies certainly aren't. But we're doing it anyway because we're being told we have no choice. Scene cleanup costs the tow companies money to do as well because we must provide Absorbol and clean up all chemicals from the roadway, and we must properly dispose of said debris and fluids in a safe and proper manner, all of which is added cost to the tow company. Currently, we are not allowed to charge for scene cleanup and must include it in the tow fee. This is a practice that must change because this is hazardous material, as I stated. We are dealing with that and must be properly disposed of. The last and final issue to deal with, the current bylaw with regards to scanning devices. I know this was brought up before because I brought it up previously at another board meeting when it was in St. Catharines. OPP has now gone with a first available tow system and no longer uses a rotation. What does this mean? This means that the OPP will call via the radio system for a first available tow in the area to respond. This system is the very same system used in all of Hamilton, Burlington, and Toronto area. To our knowledge, Niagara is the only area in Ontario that does not permit the use of scanning devices. While the licensing department takes the position that tows will show up at NRP calls by listening to the EMS and as well as fire frequencies because NRP is encrypted, this is not the case. While we agree that there may be the odd few that do this, the police at the scene know the NRP use a rotation system and can simply turn them away and remind them they will be calling from the list. Licensing has also stated that they do not want this simply because they do not want tows showing up at the scene of an accident, calling this solicitation, and stating they will charge a driver for doing so if caught. With OPP going with a first available tow system, this is the only way that a tow in Niagara would be able to hear a call for a tow and assist. This is also a matter of not only public safety, but officer safety as well. The sooner a tow can respond and remove the vehicle for police, the safer it is for all involved. Currently, the licensing board speaks of solicitation, yet they are clearly trying to prohibit something the law explicitly currently permits under the HTA. I refer to Section 177, Sub 2 of the HTA, which states, no person while on a roadway shall stop, attempt to stop, or approach a motor vehicle for the purpose of offering, selling, or providing any commodity or service to the driver or any other person in the motor vehicle. While this section does make this prohibition, Section 177, Sub 3 states that Subsection 2 does not apply to the offer, sale, or provision of towing or repair services or any other commodity or services in an emergency. Current legislation is clear that no board or level of government shall make a law that would supersede the law of a higher government. With this being said, it would be clear that the bylaw governing the use of scanning devices would be a prohibition to Section 177, Sub 3 of the HTA. We therefore ask the board to remove this bylaw entirely, allowing tow companies for the use of scanning devices accordingly for the purposes of monitoring the OPP in the Niagara area due to the changes that have implemented to the way they call for tow trucks. This is a request that is backed by the vast majority of tow owners and drivers across the Niagara region. We are paying annual fees for blue plates for our trucks, but we are being limited on how we can conduct our business. The blue plates are issued for use in all of Niagara, not just specific tow zones. Now, I understand that licensing is concerned about the scanners, saying this is about public safety because you're going to have the trucks listening to the scanners and racing to the scenes of OPP calls. This is not something that is a serious public safety concern. Now, I will agree that, yes, there are some trucks that are going to break the laws with regards to speeding. That's something that's covered under the HTA. But don't tell me that a tow truck driver listening to a scanner is more dangerous than a police officer we see every day driving our public streets, driving their vehicles while looking down at their computer screens in their cars and typing away. I'm sorry, but clearly one is far more dangerous than the other. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. We're going to allow the board to ask some questions of you right now. Member Ganzel.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Some comments that are, for me, a bit disturbing. And as chair of a technology committee, and I can't speak specifically about the force, but I'm sure the chief would probably concur, we have no desire to unencrypt our radio channels for anybody.
I understand that. We're not asking for the NRP
And I don't care what
unencrypted.
the OPP does. Let me make that clear. They're on a separate set of frequencies, and I don't know whether they're run on an encrypted channel or not, but the Niagara Regional Police Service would certainly not entertain unencrypting our communication services whatsoever. They were there for a purpose, and it's for public safety and security.
I totally
Not to-
understand that, and that's
not
not
to-
what we're asking.
Just hold on one second. Let him ask the question, then I'll allow you to respond.
So you talk about a bylaw or something here that restricts scanning. And again, I'm unfamiliar with the OPP. I know they went to a new radio system. I have no idea whether they're encrypted or not. My indication from what you've written here, they are not encrypted. But you're saying that a bylaw that we have implemented as a board tells you that you cannot use a scanner in your vehicle. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
And that's the only thing we're asking to have changed. We're not asking for the NRP to remove their encryption. We're just asking that we be allowed to have the scanning devices in our tow trucks.
Well, I would also contend that the use of a scanner is not controlled by the Niagara Regional Police Service. It's controlled under federal regulations during Industry Canada.
I understand that. However,
And the
licensing board
only
has a
way that
bylaw.
you would be able to, quote, monitor the OPP legally is to obtain from them, the OPP, some sort of a letter of understanding that they have no issue with you listening into their communications, because it's considered private or privileged.
No, the scanning devices, they are not
But
encrypted.
they're under federal regulation, not.
Correct. I totally understand they're under federal regulations, which goes further to prove that the Niagara Regional Police Licensing Board has no business even involved in the scanner bylaw whatsoever with regards to scanning devices.
We'll have a discussion at the board on that one. Thank you.
Member Marshall.
Thank you. Excuse me. If you were called out to, for instance, to the police station here to tow a car, what would the charge be to tow it to a nearby garage in Niagara Falls?
Currently, the police rate is set at $225.
I'm not asking about the police rate. This is a non-police call. How
For a
much
non-police call, I can only speak on behalf of my personal company. I can't speak for the other tow companies. My company in-town private rates are $50 for a service call.
And yet you claim that at $250, you can't make any money. You're being penalized.
I'm not claiming that at all. What I'm claiming is that the $225 is only for the services of towing. However, we're required to do all these extra things, including now we're going to a CRC collision reporting center, which was never in the contract previously with the rotation agreement. And if we look at today's rotation agreement, at no time in the rotation agreement does it state anything about having to take the vehicles to a collision reporting center.
Thank you. I agree with that.
I have questions. Is there any other board member? Okay, I'm going to ask a series of questions of Detective Sergeant Laban, and then I'll ask you for your response. I'm not going to try and get into a debate here on it, because then I'll ask for a report back from him, and we might make changes, we might not, but I want to find out what's going on this. First of all, a question for yourself. Companies you represent, are these the gentlemen and ladies in the back that you represent, or?
No, these are from taxi companies.
Oh, I'm sorry, okay. So the companies, you say you represent an assortment of towing companies. Who might they be, or?
The vast majority of them, I spoke with almost all the tow companies in Niagara, and almost every one of them are in agreement with the presentation that I've made. I've spoke with Tom James, I've spoke with Robbins Towing, who incidentally was the one who originally requested these changes be made, and has since recanted and had told me that he believes it was a mistake with regards to the tow rotations being changed the way they were.
Okay, I'm just going to advise you in the future, just give us some names. When somebody comes in and says, we represent a lot of companies, it'd be nice to have on that letter the
Absolutely.
companies you represent. Second, question for Detective Sergeant Laban. Do we have any complaints about towing companies not responding to calls in time in the 30 minutes from other than police officers on a scene? And I understand on a scene that you want to get it fixed real quick. Are there complaints from officers? I guess I'm going to allow that too. But do you have any complaints of the towing companies not coming in within 30 minutes?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Actually, if you don't mind, I'm going to direct the towing questions to Detective Constable Lindsay. That's his portfolio, so he's prepared to answer all of these questions, and he has a greater understanding.
Sure, and I want to be fair here, that I don't want to put you on the spot, because he's come up with a number of issues here I'm going to address. If you want to come back with a report on another date on this, we'll have to, because I thought it was just one issue. I thought it was just the 30 minutes, but I see a number of them. So is it more fair to have you respond to us at another meeting on some of these things, or do you want to respond to that right now?
Are you prepared? Detective Lindsay is prepared.
Go ahead, please. About the 30-minute calls, any complaints?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Initially, the majority of complaints we actually get with respect to the 30-minute response time is officers on the road.
So, and I understand that. They'd like them there in 5 minutes, like waiting for a traffic light. You think it's 10 minutes, and it's not. But, okay, I'm not going to hold you to that, but I want to discuss this down the way based on what this gentleman says. Any complaints for re-towing companies not cleaning up on, not showing up on time? How many times do we have police officers complain that taking somebody off the list because they're not there in 30 minutes? Do we have a lot of that happen, or do most of them allow some flexibility, or do we have people taken off the rotating list because of not getting there on time a lot, is what I'm asking?
Under the current bylaw, through you, Mr. Chair, it permits us, if they don't respond within 30 minutes, they can be removed from the list.
Does it happen very often?
It doesn't happen very often, but we obviously are aware of individuals or companies that are more frequent in terms of not meeting that 30-minute criteria. If that happens, then they are suspended.
Okay, Mr. York, I'm going to ask you to respond to that. Do you find that it happens a lot to your company or to other people that the police take you off the list after 30 minutes? Or are we a little bit flexible, a little bit lenient?
Honestly, I've never had an issue myself personally as a manager of SIDS Towing. I've never came across an issue where I've never been able to meet that 30-minute time limit. Again, that could be because of the fact that I was on only 2 rotations with St. Catharines and Niagara Falls, and I live in Thorold. I can be in St. Catharines in 5 to 10 minutes. I can be in Niagara Falls within 5 to 10 minutes. Now, granted, I will admit that there are some companies that are located in Niagara Falls that are getting rotations in Fort Erie and Welland and Port Colborne, simply because they have the compounds and the trucks there. And I will admit that there is a possibility that they may not be able to meet the 30 minutes, and I'm not going to debate that or argue that because I don't know what their response times are, or if they've even had trucks in that area. I can only speak for myself, and with regards to myself, I've never had a situation where I've been exceeding the 30 minutes. I've always been under that time frame in the 2 rotations I've been on.
Okay, in fairness to you, I'm going to ask Detective Constable Lindsay to report back to us at the next meeting on this situation, on how many people have been taken off the list, if you can, and what advice, what changes we can make to this. Is 45 minutes better? Is 35 minutes better? Is there a better way to do it, or do you want to touch that now?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I've been in the unit for approximately 4 years now. That being said, the 30-minute criteria has not been an issue thus far. Normally when it becomes problematic is in the wintertime, where drivers receive a phone call at 2 o'clock in the morning. They have to allow their vehicles to warm up for 10, 15 minutes. If it turns out a vehicle owner, vehicle is in Niagara Falls and they have to go to Welland, there's no practical way they can make it within 30 minutes given the fact that they have to allow the vehicles to warm up. So thus far, the 30-minute criteria has not been an issue. We do have some individuals who are frequent flyers, who are problem children that we do have to address, and they do get suspended from the list. But for the most part, the 30-minute criteria is not an issue.
Okay, Mr. York, I guarantee you all these points we will respond to you on, but we may not have a decision today.
That's fine. I just wanted to make one more comment with regards to the 30 minutes that he spoke about at 2 o'clock in the morning. Yes, it does happen that we do get calls at that time, and Mr. Lindsay is making the assumption that the tow company that is based in Niagara Falls being called out actually is sending the truck from Niagara Falls. He has no idea where that truck is actually located or that driver. That driver could very well be in Welland, living in Welland, and have the truck at home with him in Welland. So I understand his point that he's making. However, he's making the point based on an assumption, not fact.
Okay, Detective Lindsay, you've talked to Mr. York, or can I ask that you talk to him after this in the future to sort out some of these things as well?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I can speak to Mr. York.
Okay. I've got Mr. York, yeah. Okay, next question. The yard for, you had said that there's a building required in each city? I think it's just a yard for towed vehicles. Is that not correct?
For years, that's all that was required.
Not a building, not a bricks and mortar, but a yard.
No, for years, that's all that was required. Now, currently, the way that the changes were made by the licensing committee is we're required to have an actual operating business in that city. With a
Business or building?
Business.
Okay, you had said building in your presentation. So.
Because that's the way it was discussed to us at the licensing meeting. When all the tow owners were called in by the licensing department, that was what was told to us was going to be required, was that we were going to have an actual operating business, and the way they were reading the bylaws was we had to have a building there.
Okay, Detective Lindsay, do you want to comment on that, or through you, Chief, to the detective?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I would imagine you want to go home sometime today, so I shall keep my, my comments prefaced accordingly. Coles Note's version in terms of what transpired. In October, we met with the tow industry, which included anywhere from 35 to 40 individuals. It was representative of the towing industry itself. At that point, we said, because we were under the impression that the tow industry, for the most part, could govern themselves and could follow the rules. Section 2 of the current bylaw stated individuals that wanted to have a access to a tow list, for example, Niagara Falls and St. Catharines. Up until that point, the only requirement at that point was you'd have to have a tow vehicle, so you'd have to have at least 2 trucks if you wanted 2 jurisdictions. You'd actually have to have a tow yard, and that was it. Unfortunately, what happened was individuals were not following the rules, and the thing had to change. So under the bylaw, it was never ever enforced. Section 2 of the bylaw specifically said you had to have a tow yard and a business within the jurisdiction for which you wish to tow. That was one of the things we addressed in October and said to them, from this point forward, come January, we're probably going to be looking at this to better serve the towing industry. That's where we arrived today. So as of January 1st, we told all these individuals that were there that there was going to be a soft rollout. Well, that soft rollout actually took place effectively May 31st. One of the issues we continue to have is you may actually have, the plates are not specific for jurisdiction. So let's say you have 2 plates, you have 2 vehicles. A plate is not specifically allocated to a specific municipality. So you could, in theory, have those 2 plates, even though being on the St. Catharines and the Niagara Falls list, you could actually have both of those vehicles in St. Catharines, and hence why one of the issues came up with respect to the 30-minute thing. So that's where all this stemmed from. So when Mr. York makes mention of the fact that he has the backing of all these towing companies, I don't know if that's factual. All I can say, sir, is this. I've had many conversations with many tow owners, and like anything, it's difficult to actually start a new process, and nobody particularly likes change, but we are where we are today because it had to change. The process and the system wasn't working the way it should be working.
Okay, thank you for that. Then I'm going to sum up this. I have one question. The rest of them are things like the extra charges for bringing the tow vehicles around to the station here, or to the headquarters, that I understand is a new thing, and it takes some of your time. We might want to make allowance for that in the charges that the towing companies are allowed to pay. I understand that. And the scene cleanup, I get your point on that. So these are things I'd like Detective Lindsay to discuss with you, and maybe in the future they can be addressed, maybe in the not too distant future on it. And I'll come to you in 1 second. But a question for you, and I'll expand on other points, is do we have a bylaw as the Regional Police Board on scanners? Do we have our own bylaw?
Through you, Mr. Chair, under the current bylaw, scanners are not permitted for the whole reason why, for public safety. Yeah. Mr. York makes mention of the fact that there are no other jurisdiction that it's actually in the bylaw. That is not correct. The detective sergeant did a precursory glance, and he found 2 jurisdictions that actually have no scanners allowed in their bylaw. One of them being Halton region, and the other one being the county of Dufferin. Both of them specifically indicate, and I do have copies of their bylaws indicating that they do not permit scanners under their bylaw.
Okay, Detective Lindsay, I'd appreciate it if you would sit down with him and go over some of these points and report back to us on these. I understand his point about the cleanups and the extra charges for coming here, and there might be other issues too, but then we can bring it to the board to discuss through Woody McKaig, our solicitor, and items like that. Is there any other questions from the board here of the presenter? Do you have any other comments, sir?
Yes, I would like to make one other further comment with regards to the scanner bylaw. Detective Lindsay here had made statement that Halton does not allow for the use of scanners. However, what Mr. Lindsay here is not notifying to the board is that the highways that run through Halton, such as the QEW and the 401 and the 403, all fall under the jurisdiction of the Burlington OPP, which also do allow scanning devices because they call on a first available system.
Okay, so I make a suggestion to you that when you meet with Detective Lindsay, if there's other owners you represent, get them with you.
With all due respect, Mr. Chair, I have spoken with Mr. Lindsay about this at length with regards to the scanner, and we're getting nowhere. This is why we're here at the board today. We're asking the board to make the decision, not the licensing department.
You're talking about the scanner, or you're
with
talking about everything?
regards to the scanner bylaw specifically, we're asking the board to make that decision because Mr. Lindsay has repeated to me numerous times that is a decision for the board to make to remove that bylaw, not licensing.
Okay, then I'm going to wait for a report from Detective Lindsay, and he's going to consult with our solicitor in that, and then we'll address it. I have a question here from Member Ganzel.
Thank you. In moving forward on the scanner issue, I would highly recommend that our counsel, Mr. McKeag, be involved in that. I believe it's a federal regulation. It is not something that would be controlled by bylaw.
If I could interject briefly, we're not interfering, we're not suggesting anything with CRTC or federal or frequencies or radio licenses. It's simply something that this board has put into their licensing bylaw. So it's not prohibited federally. It's prohibited because of the bylaw that this board has passed. So in fairness to Detective Lindsay, he's had these discussions, worked on behalf of the board, and he will come back as you've asked him to, but it's the board that has to make the decision. And you're right in incorporating Mr. McKeag in that. But so it's not a CRTC thing at all, Ken. It's a bylaw that you people have put on top of it.
I think it's something we can review.
And I'm also interested in what other jurisdictions do it and why it started, and things change, but we'll address it. So thank you very much for your presentation, Mr. York. Detective Lindsay will get in touch with you, and then we'll discuss it at our next meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, next, all those in favor of receiving this? Carried. Next, we have new business. We have a group here from the taxi companies here to represent. I don't know what it's about, but we'll bring you up on new business. Do we have one person? I'm just asking the crowd there. I don't want this meeting to go on for 4 hours because none of you has told me that you were coming in advance. Is there one spokesman that can identify your issue for your whole group? Is there? I guess there isn't, because I can't have 20 people up here, guys. I'm going to have to hold you to the next meeting because I don't know what it's about. I won't. Not right now, you can't. I just want to know if there's one person to speak, fine. If not, I might as well ask you to go home and then give us a report so we can bring it up to our next committee meeting. I'll allow one, if you're united on what you're going to talk about, which I don't know what it is, I'll allow one speaker here. Not now, but I will in new business. So think about that. If you have one speaker, we'll allow it. If not, you can go home and come and send us reports, and we'll get you up here. I'll let you think about that, okay? So the next is new business bylaw enforcement licensing I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong one. License Bureau. No, I'm right. Bylaw and enforcement and licensing unit financial operating statement. And can I have a mover and seconder on this, please? Member Bonham, Member Castle. Comments on this or questions? I see none. Can I ask you a favor? Can you go back there and just see them and just see if there's one person? I'll go back and talk to them. Think about it, Bob. Okay. Member Marshall, go ahead.
Thank you. Excuse me, through you, Chair, to to the chief. There's an indication that we have a $91,000 deficit in the presentation. Is this correct?
Sorry, which report are you on, sir?
Report number 3, the final back page.
Yeah. Laura's prepared to respond to you on that, if you will.
Thank you. Laura?
Through you to the chair. So this report is coming from the May licensing committee meeting where the board recommended that staff prepare the operating statement for the licensing unit to be brought forward and looked at on a quarterly basis to ensure that we are achieving that full cost recovery that the unit is to achieve. So this is year-to-date May, and as we indicated, or as I indicated in May, there is a shortfall that even the budget, 2017 budget, was reflecting. So this is just supporting the fact that even when we look at actual results at year-to-date May, that it's still indicating a shortfall deficit. The 91,000 includes an assumption that there are some indirect costs that would be allocated to the unit.
Thank you. Excuse me. I'm kind of stunned by the extent of the shortfall. I'm sorry. Did we include all of the costs on this one, Laura? The last time we had a presentation, there were some missing costs.
Through you to the chair. So the May report was based on the 2017 budget, and it showed a shortfall of about 16%. So the forecast presented in column 2 represents the actual cost and includes the collective bargaining rate increases that we received for January 1 and for July 1st, 2017. So the actual forecast is still in line with the May report that was presented, which suggests that the revenues that we're currently receiving or collecting has a shortfall of about, in this case, 14%. But the one I reported back in May was showing a shortfall of about 16%. So we're still consistent, and we haven't deviated much from the original report.
Okay, but that report that came through had was not complete, if you recall. Finance had not worked on it, preparing it.
So through you to the chief, to the chair. Sorry. No, we did. There were 2 reports that were reported in May. One of them was referenced as a full cost recovery model, where we used the 2017 budget, and in that one we did record all costs associated to running the licensing unit independently. That was both the direct costs and indirect costs, which included the 4 vehicles, maintenance costs of the 4 vehicles, the amortization of the 4 vehicles, plus some costs associated to property, rent, utilities, an allocation for finance, IT, and insurance. So back in May, we did report a fully costed out model, and that at that time was suggesting that we were going to be 16% short of the revenues that we're collecting.
Thank you. Thank you, Chief.
Member Bonham.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just, I guess through you to the Chief, is it the intention, now that you've dimensioned the shortfall, that the service is going to bring forward a recommendation with regard to an order of magnitude adjustment going forward? Thank you.
I'm going to turn to the licensing people for this, but the discussion was that I think the intent was to report on a more regular basis to the board as best we could so that we could see these before they got to the end, because the board didn't want to be reported just on a deficit. So whatever adjustments can be made will be made with the goal to drive towards that. But I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Chris?
Thank you, Chief, through you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I believe what was being explored was, and Laura Rulo can speak to this as well, but we were talking about a cost of living increase annually as opposed to waiting for several years before making a large increase, which would impact the industry in one shot, in a one-shot process. And we were definitely looking at how much each portfolio is costing and maybe tweaking our fees accordingly to come back to a revenue neutral position.
Okay, so I just want to be clear that this report, the summary, is going to lead to some action with regard to adjustments on a quarterly basis or whatever the frequency may be that's most suited.
Through you, Mr. Chair, to Member Bonham, our fees are actually adjusted annually, though. So we would, I think the idea was to report quarterly so that the board has basically a heads up prior to the end of the year, as actually Member Caslin had spoken about, so that we could make adjustments for the next year moving forward.
Just wondering if annual fees are suited going forward, given the changing nature of the expenses. If we're reviewing quarterly, I appreciate that quarterly adjustments may not be appropriate, but perhaps a biannual review of what the rates are would allow us to stay current with quarterly movement and not have such an adjustment or an order of magnitude adjustments, I suggest, at one-year intervals, just for consideration. Thank you.
So Lisa, what's your comment to that?
Sorry, we were talking when you were saying it. Can you just, I think you're asking, can we do it more often? Is that what you asked?
Yeah, he's asking twice a year to take a look at it rather than just responding at the end of the year when we have a deficit of $91,000 or whatever.
So can I get a hold, I'm just going to talk to my counterparts at the region as well, because our fees are approved here. Deb, I'm going to ask you maybe to weigh in, but our fees are approved by this board or recommended by this board, but then the final approval comes at the region when the region puts the final approval in for our fees. So I would want to talk to them to see what the impact of having like a semi-annual increase would be, because there is usually quite a bit of delay in getting the final approvals done. It's with all our fees, special duty, everything. So let me just talk to them. We'll do it as part of our budget process too, okay, and see when we can increase fees on a regular basis. But as Craig pointed out, some of our fees are charged annually, so they're an annual fee that we charge, and I don't know all the fees off the top of my head, but they're an annual fee that we charge that you couldn't really increase partway during the year. You'd want to increase at the beginning of the year. I mean, one of our options is to increase the fees and then start putting the money into a reserve and then use that to offset the deficit of following year or the current year as well, because it's supposed to be cost neutral, right? So that's an option too. But we'll take a look. The three of us will take a look at it and come back and talk to our counterparts at the region to get their input.
And as well, we look at increasing fees, but we also look at the services we provide. Maybe we have to be more efficient, but we'll look at that. Mayor Bonham.
Just to clarify, the reason for bringing it up is it would render moot the initiative to look at it quarterly. If we're not going to take some action based on what we see, all it's going to do is give us an 8 or 9 month foretelling of the fact we're going to have a somewhat magnificent deficit at year end. I would think the intent and purpose of more frequent reviews would be to make adjustments, not necessarily on the fly, I don't mean ad hoc, but at reasonable intervals so that we begin to chew in whatever forecasted deficit we may be seeing early on in the year, such that we come to year end and we don't have much to talk about in terms of a deficit number for an organization that's supposed to be working on breaking even. Thank you.
Yep, and that's why we need questions like what Bob asked with what are you doing about it, more or less. So, okay, any other comments on this item? Member Genzel.
Thank you, Chair. And through you to the Chief and probably to Lisa. You just referenced that the region approves our fees. Is that something new? I haven't heard of that in the 5 years that I've been on the board. I thought we set the fees.
I mean, it's Deb, we send them to the region and then it goes to regional council. It's just a process. They've never, it's a user fee, so they have to approve the changes to our user fees. It's just a process. There's never been an issue with it. It's just sometimes there's delays with their meetings and our meetings and the timing and stuff like that. So it's just that there's delays in it, but there's never, it's just process. It's not because it's a user fee.
So just
I can get you the legalities behind it if you
No,
need to.
I'm assuming it's just a flow-through for formal approval.
It is just
Okay,
a flow-through.
thank you very much.
Yeah, it's somewhat like a rubber stamp because we just did the pay duties in that last month. I mean, certainly regional councilors can ask questions and that, but, okay, any other comments on this item? All those in favor of receiving it? Carried. Okay, next is the Uber report, and that, Mr. Schaefer, if you want to come up to the podium, please. This is the Uber response report on TNC review 2017. Chris Schaefer is going to, from Uber, is going to talk to us for 10 minutes or whatever time he takes, and then if there's any questions. Okay, Mr. Schaefer, you know to push the button for the red. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's on already, actually. Do you mind if I borrow your tape? Good morning, Chair, board members. My name is Chris Schaefer, Public Policy Manager with Uber Canada. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I appreciate it. Good to be before you again today. Presentation, want to start off briefly at the top of the presentation. Just note that we have a strong track record of compliance. About a dozen bylaws passed in the province of Ontario alone. Some quotes I provided, more in the written material. Ottawa regulator, overall compliance by the one licensed PTC, private transportation company, same thing as a TNC here. Uber Canada has been very high. Toronto regulator, Uber is complying. We have strong partnerships that are indicative of our good, solid working relationship with municipalities, both at the provincial and municipal level, as well as companies. We've just launched our Uber Eats McDelivery partnership with McDonald's. We have a partnership with Innisfil. They wanted to launch public transit. It was very expensive. They've partnered with Uber in lieu of traditional public transit to provide Uber Pool. So we're essentially the transit service in Innisfil, Ontario for the town. We have an upcoming RFP that we secured with Metrolinx. I can tell you more about that at some point in the future. We're partnering with them as well. All of this to indicate at a bare minimum, the strong working relationship we enjoy with municipalities across Ontario. I've encouraged board solicitor as well as other members, the licensing unit, happy to provide names, phone numbers, email addresses of any regulator in this province at the municipal level that regulates ride sharing. Happy to have you call them independently, talk to them. They will iterate to you the strong working relationship and strong track record of compliance that they enjoy vis-a-vis Uber with respect to their bylaw. Off the top, Uber in Niagara region, I understand and totally appreciate that there were costs incurred to set up a licensing regime here that was new. It was new, a new TNC category, legal fees associated with that, new ways of doing things mean costs to the licensing unit. Fully appreciate that and understand it. We've done our best to work with the licensing unit to reduce labor costs through various things I've outlined in the material I've shared with you today. We've accommodated various licensing unit requests as well. We have our standard decal that's required by the bylaw. The licensing unit requested a second decal that reads Niagara region. We've provided that. We think, as you recall from my very first presentation here, decals are bad public policy for a whole host of reasons I outlined there, and I'm happy to outline again here. But nonetheless, we agreed to a second decal here, not a problem. With respect to account status, new vehicle additions, renewals, all of these things, various requests the licensing unit has made of Uber, and we're complying and providing those additional requests in good corporate goodwill and trying to be a good corporate citizen here vis-a-vis the licensing unit. The Police Services Board, as I understand, has an objective here, and it's basically be given the cost associated with this licensing category, either to increase fees or change the process to decrease the required resources. So I've submitted, as you know, a proposal that I know from experience in dealing with municipal regulation in various cities across Ontario will reduce workload and costs associated by the licensing unit. I'm also aware, of course, because I've responded to it, the licensing unit has their own proposal. I have prepared material I've shared with you already yesterday with respect to why I think the licensing unit's proposal, with all due respect, actually will achieve the opposite. We'll end up with higher costs and more workload. The proposal will create new additional work. For example, right now, we handle the upfront onboarding of drivers and vehicles. All of those drivers come to Uber. So anybody with an incomplete application, we deal with. If we move to a new system where they come to the licensing unit first and we never see them, people with incomplete applications are going to come before it. Right now, we never let incomplete applications go to the licensing unit. They don't see any of that. Anything they see is always a complete application. If we start with the licensing unit doing that work first, people with incomplete applications will come before the board. That's new work that they've never had to deal with. In communicating to current or prospective drivers with respect to application requirements or with respect to documents that expire, a driver's license, vehicle inspection, criminal background check, and in communicating the annual renewal of that license, we handle all of that communication. If a driver doesn't have an updated document, we deactivate them temporarily until they upload the required documents to us, and then we communicate that to the licensing unit. If we move to the licensing unit proposal, they've got to communicate all of that with the drivers. That's a new responsibility that they've never had before. Currently, we handle all of that. The proposal by the licensing unit, I suspect, could lead to appeals. Right now, because Uber's the communication vehicle between drivers and the TNC, not the licensing unit, we just share data with the licensing unit. Drivers come to us, we communicate with drivers. We move to a new system the licensing unit's proposed. I suspect because the licensing unit would be the communication vehicle, if not, if you like, the face of that communication channel, I suspect some drivers may seek appeals that are available in the bylaw that they would not be doing currently because they deal exclusively with Uber. I've outlined some other concerns that the licensing unit proposal could present in the material. One thing I say, and I don't say this, I say this with all due respect, we know from experience the ride-sharing industry is fundamentally different from the taxi industry, and I'll give you one reason why. Majority of drivers, rideshare drivers, drive 5 to 10 hours a week to supplement income. They aren't doing it.
Hey, come on. I'm going to ask you to leave if you make comments like that.
They aren't doing it on a full-time basis. There are, of course, full-time drivers. Majority are doing it for 5 to 10 hours a week. As a result, processes and bylaws incorporated across the province of Ontario realize and recognize that reality. So the onboarding process, becoming a driver, they come to Uber, we prepare the material, share it with the licensing authority, rather than having drivers come in to HQ here, because a lot of them have full-time jobs. They have to take a day off work to do that. We know from experience that doesn't work. So if a change as contemplated by the licensing unit is adopted here, I have to be very clear with you. We know it doesn't work for the ride-sharing industry, and Uber would no longer be able to operate in Niagara region, unfortunately. We don't want to. We love servicing Niagara region. We want to be here, but that is the truth, and I'd be being dishonest to you if I didn't indicate that. We have prepared for your information what we call an audit-based model proposal. It's another proposal. It's not the licensing unit proposal. It is our proposal. It's in effect in a number of municipalities across Ontario. This is the way they're doing it. They found that it has reduced the workload and cost associated with licensing. In a nutshell, we collect all the data like we're doing currently in Niagara. We share that data via an Excel spreadsheet with the scraped data from all the documents. The bylaw currently already has an audit provision in it, that the licensing authority here can audit the TNC, Uber, to ensure compliance. In fact, if the TNC is not complying with the bylaw, the licensing unit has the power to remove the TNC, our ability to operate in Niagara region. The tools for this proposal are already found in the bylaw. I would encourage the board to consider this option, and I'm happy to go into more detail and questions about what that is. I've shared information vis-a-vis material I've submitted. You'll also find in the material you have before you what I've articulated as cosmetic changes to implement an audit-based model, part of which is already in your bylaw. This, unlike the board unlike the licensing unit proposal, will in fact, we know from experience in other municipalities, reduce costs. But I do also at the same time want you to know, as best as I can articulate it, that we want to be and continue to try to be good corporate citizens. So even though we know with the audit-based model that that will end up reducing workload and reducing fees, because the only responsibility the licensing unit would have is to collect the data that we already provide to the licensing unit and audit us. So scientifically sample a random sample like other cities are doing and ensure compliance that way with vehicle registration, criminal background checks. They could do random trips on the Uber platform and do spot inspections that way, ensure that all the drivers are up to date and current. And if not, they have the ability already in the bylaw to remove our license. But to be good corporate citizens, even though we know the audit model will reduce costs, if you want and decide to move to a Hamilton fee model of $50,000 per year with a 6 to 11 cent per trip fee, I'm not going to jump up and down. We want to be in Niagara region. So if you feel the need to increase fees from the current 7,000 give or take, I think it's 7,500 annual to 50,000 annual, I would support that. If you need an 11 cent per trip fee as you're collecting currently on top of the 50,000, I would support that. I would ask, and I'll summarize here because I'm just shy of the 10-minute mark, is that there's a lot of information before you. I can appreciate that, a lot to think about. If anything, you might consider deferring a decision to give you a little bit more time to think about it. If not, I would hope you'd consider the audit-based model. We know from experience using that model in other municipalities, it works. You've got the tools in your bylaw to implement it with a few cosmetic changes I provided to board solicitor. And if need be, again, we'd support a fee increase, although we know it's not necessary if you were to implement the audit-based model. But, you know, we want to be good corporate citizens. We want to be in Niagara. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to ask Detective Sergeant Laban to comment on this, and then Woody to comment if he wishes on this. Do you have any comments on what just
Yes, Mr. Chair, thank you. Just a couple of, am I allowed to ask Mr. Schaefer some questions based on his?
By all means, go ahead.
I mean, I'm going to go through from start to finish, I guess, in the order that you presented. You showed your decal, Mr. Schaefer. Did you also bring the Niagara Region decal?
I don't have a copy of that currently, but I know it's as you described it in your report. It's about yay big. It reads Niagara Region on it. I believe, if my memory serves me, black lettering on a clear background.
So, and I never got an answer to this. I asked, why did you make the background different from your decal?
Sorry, I should say through the chair to you. Sorry, my apology. It was designed by our design team. No particular reason. I know, and I say this respectfully to you, sir, in your report, you, I can't recall the exact language, but you suggest it's in order to dupe or deceive compliance folks. And I can tell you, look, even without a decal, let's be honest about this, even without the Niagara Region decal or the Uber traditional decal that I've showed you here, riders don't need this to secure a ride vis-a-vis the Uber platform. They request a ride, they get the driver's name, photo, make and model of the car, and license plate. This, they don't need. Before the bylaw was passed, this didn't exist on Uber vehicles. Riders have no problem getting inside and locating and getting inside their Uber vehicle. The bylaw required this. I disagree. I think it's bad public policy. Why? For the very same reasons that Mr. Laban suggested in his report, was that somebody that's not an Uber driver, that hasn't been licensed by the licensing unit here, could go out with pretty basic modern technology of printers, duplicate something very similar, if not identical, to this or any other decal that the board, the board here might consider implementing. That's why we encourage cities, as I've in regions and as I've articulated way back at our very first meeting. I think decals, period, are bad public policy, because people can duplicate them, and then maybe they drive around, a bandit taxi operator, not an Uber driver, not a taxi driver, somebody that wants to break the law, could drive around, make up something like this on the printer or the Niagara Region decal, the one that says Niagara Region, put it on their window, roll up to, I'm making it up, a senior's home, and maybe they don't know technology and the app as well, say, hey, you want to get an Uber ride? And the senior might say, my grandson told me about the Uber, sounds legit, I'll get in. That's bad. This, or any decal, encourages that kind of illegal behavior. However, the board passed a bylaw with the requirement for this decal. We didn't fight it. The licensing unit asked us to voluntarily agree to another second decal that's not required in your bylaw. As good corporate citizens, we said yes, we'd be happy to do it. And we've provided a second decal. I understand Mr. LeBon is not happy with the decal we provided. And I'm happy to talk to you today about another different decal. It's irrelevant to me personally. I think decals, period, are bad public policy. But again, the board requires one. We'll do it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The other thing is, and I received a copy of your report, Mr. Schaefer, thank you. The comparison of key criteria, where's the data to support your chart here with respect to the staff review model versus audit model, staff cost, time, high versus low? I don't see any corresponding data to indicate where you came to those conclusions.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I would point back to, right here, again, from our experience, I'm speaking solely from my experience. There's cities like Waterloo, cities like Ottawa, cities like Hamilton that operate under what I call the audit-based model. The bylaw actually is, funny enough, is what I call a hybrid. It's a hybrid between the traditional sort of licensing role that we were very used to with respect to taxis and limousines, and it sort of grafted on the T&C category and combines elements of the traditional licensing role vis-a-vis taxi and the new licensing role vis-a-vis T&Cs. So that audit-based model is already in the bylaw. From our experience, the concerns I've raised with respect to the licensing unit proposal is that I think there are frankly unintended consequences. Speaking from experience of a company that operates under various models, principally the audit-based model, in 450 cities around the world for the last 3 or 4 odd years with UberX's introduction worldwide. We have a lot of experience from that history, and I can tell you, based on our experience, what we've experienced in terms of the labor, but frankly, in labor and costs, what I would encourage, and I have encouraged, is folks in your unit, board solicitor, to contact any regulator that's passed a bylaw to regulate ride sharing in Canada, the province of Ontario, and there's about a dozen now, and all of them can have a very thorough, detailed discussion with any board member, be it the board solicitor or otherwise, or somebody in Mr. LeBon's unit, about the audit model and how that works, and the cost savings and labor reductions it is saving with no sacrifice to public safety or consumer protection. None whatsoever. All of those folks will communicate to you a solid working relationship with Uber Canada and a strong track record of compliance. Unfortunately, when I read your report, Mr. LeBon, I didn't see that reflected, and I continue to want to work with your unit, to work with the board. I'm confident that we can get there, and I look forward to doing that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We'll get to my report after, I assume, so in which case the board can ask questions.
I just wonder if you have any questions of him.
Yeah, so, and throughout this process, I hope you don't mind if I refer to Detective Webb. That's his portfolio, so a lot of this has been experienced by Detective Webb himself. Okay. So, no, that's fine, sir.
Okay, Woody, do you have any questions at all, comments?
I do, if I can. Just one issue, Chris. One of the problems with the licensing unit is that the IT system that you provide the data on isn't compatible with theirs. I think you know that. I think it's the same problem in Ottawa. I talked to Ottawa yesterday. And what that means is that everything has to be inputted manually. All the driver information has to be inputted manually or one by one by the licensing unit folks. And that's going to be the case whether the board decides to go with your proposed audit system, as you call it, or whether they decide to stick with there is now. Well, just a second. I'm told that that is the case. Because the drivers have to get into the Niagara system. Do you have any means, or does Uber have any will, I guess, to adapt something at their end to make sure that there can be a seamless transfer, regardless of which way the board goes on the audit system or the current system?
Through Mr. Chair, thank you, Mr. Pegg. Good question. So what we're doing in cities like Ottawa that have an audit-based model is essentially it's an Excel spreadsheet. It's an Excel spreadsheet. Sorry, I'll get a little bit closer to the microphone. And what we do is, to give it in a nutshell, we scrape the data from driver's licenses, from vehicle safety standard inspection forms, from MTO driver abstracts. We collect all this information. We retain, and bylaws often have an obligation for us to retain hard copy evidence of all of these documents for every driver and vehicle. So we're already doing that. For other cities, what we do is, and it's an Excel spreadsheet, that's not, as you know and appreciate, not sophisticated technology that I assume the licensing unit can handle. Right now, they're collecting actually physical electronic copies of all of these documents. That's rare in our experience across Ontario. They don't usually collect them. The beauty of an audit-based model is they get on a daily, if they like, weekly basis, however the cadence that they prefer, and we're flexible, an Excel spreadsheet up to date of every driver that we've reviewed the applications and submitted to the board. The difference here is the board then would have an up-to-date list. They could do several things with it. They could randomly sample from the, let's say, the top 300, or if they wanted, or a random sample of 300 people and say, this week we want to audit them. We want to see every document of that driver and vehicle, because you, Uber, Mr. TNC, have an obligation to only ensure compliant drivers and vehicles are on the road in Niagara region. If you're caught not doing that, we can yank your license and ability to operate in Niagara region. So they can audit us that way. They can do trips on the platform without us knowing, without drivers knowing as a customer, and then come to us, and this is what other cities do, and say, okay, we took 20 trips this week. We want to audit those 20 trips. We want all the documents associated with that trip. So bottom line is the technology doesn't have to be sophisticated. It can be as basic as Excel. Nonetheless, what I've always expressed, I think, to you, to the chair, and to the licensing unit, where we can get meetings with the licensing unit and their IT staff, we do this all the time. We're in continual meetings with the licensing units and enforcement and IT, particularly because as a tech company we have some expertise, as you can imagine. We're in constant, regular contact and meetings with cities across the province. It has been challenging at times, admittedly, and I say this with all due respect, getting meetings with Mr. LeBon at times.
Can I follow up? I spoke to Anthony DeMonte in Ottawa yesterday, and he did explain the Excel spreadsheet that they get. But if and I'm not by any stretch of the imagination a computer expert or an IT expert, but my understanding is, and maybe Evan, you can correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is that even an Excel spreadsheet is not going to give the licensing unit the capability that they have to just have all of the names run electronically weekly to pick up new criminal charges or police contacts or anything like that. Am I right about that, Evan?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that is correct.
Okay. So I'm back to my original question. The Excel spreadsheet gives us a list of names, and what you're saying is that the audit system, as you go through, and if you got 200 or 500 names on it, you pick 10 or 20 or whatever, you do the check. The check that we have in place for all other driver licenses allows for a thorough audit, basically a weekly audit of everybody on the list. And the only way that can be done is by inputting all of the information into our system, and that is what is time-consuming. And that's going to be time-consuming whether we go with the audit system or whether we stay with the current system. So I'm back to my question. Can Uber do something more than provide us with an Excel sheet, a spreadsheet? Can you I'm not saying that you want to, I'm not suggesting you adapt your IT systems worldwide to to accommodate Niagara, but can you not do something where you can make the adjustment on your end to send us information that can seamlessly be incorporated into our system? Because what we're being asked to do is to revamp our entire IT system. And Ottawa, they get the spreadsheet, but they're having issues as well trying to integrate it. They get the names, but they're having issues trying to integrate it. We're having massive issues we can't do it. So that's where the time comes in. And if you can come up with a solution to that on your end so that it comes in seamlessly, then I think that makes your lives a lot easier, does it not? If you just get it, if it comes in a format where it just goes into our system. So can you do that?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So I think you've raised some good points in terms of IT and being a global tech company around the world, and challenges that might pop up if one municipality globally wants something a little bit different than the rest or a majority. That does present challenges, and I'd be lying if I said it didn't. With that said, despite working for a tech company, perhaps because of my age, I'm also not a tech person. Well, what I can commit to you, and I always make this commitment because I know we do it, is we're in constant working relationships with IT folks in cities across, meeting their IT needs as best as we can. So would I commit to having IT folks at Uber that work on these challenges come to Niagara region and see what can be done? Absolutely, because no doubt there's IT expertise that we can bring to bear if given the opportunity to do so. What I would just put a final point on is that the concerns I've raised, and I don't need to reiterate them, of the licensing unit proposal is I think it creates a whole bunch of new additional work that was never contemplated or never currently being done by the licensing unit that would then sit on top of what other work exists. So at the very least, I think either the status quo, imperfect as it may be, is probably more desirable than the licensing unit proposal, in my opinion. And the audit-based model, I think, given the ability to implement it so easily because it's already in the bylaw, would be if you like, Mr. McKeag, a marginal, at the very least, improvement to what the current process is.
Member Ganzel has a question.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Mr. Schaefer, a question to yourself on this one. Toronto, I believe, has licensed Uber within its jurisdiction. Is that correct?
Through you, Mr. Chair, correct.
So Toronto is there. Okay, and you mentioned Waterloo, Hamilton, and Ottawa, which I believe you indicated are on using an audit method, as you indicated. What is Toronto using?
Through Mr. Chair, a very similar model. What I can tell you is...
Similar to what?
Similar to the audit-based model. The difference is, unlike, I guess, they're a big, as you know, big municipality with a lot of resources they can bring to bear, IT and otherwise, that unfortunately most cities, frankly, all of the rest of the cities in Ontario don't enjoy the resources Toronto has. So what they've done actually is quite in a very, kudos to them, in a very technologically savvy, sophisticated way that's costing them millions of dollars to build, have built a tech system that automatically licenses within an hour or so, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, solely without human intervention, technology that licenses. And the unfortunate reality is for almost every other municipality that I know of, to implement a system like that, no municipality I know can afford the millions, if not tens of millions of dollars to implement this system over time and keep it up to date. Or if they could, the licensing cost would be, the cost recovery would be so prohibitive on companies like TNCs, like Uber, we simply just couldn't operate because the fees would have to be jacked up so high that it wouldn't make the cost of doing business no longer, worth it in a region like Niagara.
So just from an understanding on that, if somebody goes to your platform, a new driver, puts in their information and everything else, is that information, I'll say in a real-time environment, basically transferred as an electronic record into Toronto at 2 in the morning? Their system does what it does and returns probably a flag back to your organization, yes or no? Is that basically something almost in a real-time environment that they've built?
Through you, Mr. Chair. In a nutshell, for sake of time, yes. The one it's not even a caveat. What I would just the further color, if you like, that I would give to your question is that there is sometimes days, it could be weeks, months, depending on how much the prospective Uber driver has done in order to have, if you like, their application materials together. So, for example, a driver at the very least could input their name and upload a driver's license. That driver's license then pops up into our system. We have doc check reviewers because, again, the region here, the licensing unit, doesn't get any material until we've compiled it all together and prepared it to go over to licensing unit. We would review maybe a driver's license and say, it's expired. We then reject it. The driver may take another 3 weeks, prospective driver, to upload that document. So in that sense, there's a bunch of work that goes on beforehand that the licensing unit here never experiences or sees. Unfortunately, with their proposal, they'd start to get all of that new work. But once it's done, if you like the application, I'm just using short form, it is then, you're correct, uploaded electronically via secure file transfer protocol that we use in cities across Canada. And more or less in real time, it's a few hours generally, Monday to Friday, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, the driver is licensed.
And that system that Toronto put in, I think there was a fair bit of publicity last summer over, quote, Uber arriving in Toronto. Was that implemented in the fall of 2016?
Through you, Mr. Chair. The bylaw, and I'm going bit by memory, I've worked on all the bylaws across Ontario, and I say there's about a dozen of them now. I'm happy to name them if you'd like. In Toronto, the bylaw passed in May of 2016. There was a period of time where the bylaw was not enforced yet, and I think, although I'm going by memory, I have to check, I think the bylaw came into force sometime around September or October that year, and during that time, the IT staff and other staff at the City of Toronto, I assume, behind the scenes, although we were working with them, our IT folks and our bylaw compliance folks, on getting that system up and running so that when the bylaw came into force, which was some months later, the system would be ready to begin, if you like.
Okay, thank you. Those were my questions.
Member Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you. Just a question of when a person applies through you to become an Uber driver, and you grant them, they meet your criteria and you grant them. Are they allowed to be an Uber driver anywhere, or just in the jurisdiction that they've applied from?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So I'll just add a little bit of color to your question because you mentioned meet our criteria. So in Niagara region, of course, it's not our criteria. It is the bylaws criteria. So we have a duty under the bylaw currently as it's drafted, as you can appreciate. Our license as a transportation network company or TNC is dependent on meeting the criteria of this bylaw. So one of the criteria is that we obviously don't allow drivers to drive on the platform, to have access to the Uber driver app to receive trip requests if they don't meet the requirements of that bylaw. So just to make that clear, in cities where there isn't a bylaw, we have our own criteria, which includes a background check on the driver, vehicle inspection, all the things that bylaws generally require. Even in Niagara region, before a bylaw was passed, we were running background checks on drivers, criminal background checks, vehicle inspections, motor vehicle reference checks, and letting and not letting certain people on the platform. To answer your question more specifically that you asked, right now, so cities like Toronto, Ottawa, Hamilton, London, Windsor, Barrie, Innisfil, Mississauga, Oakville, I may be missing a few, Windsor, have bylaws to regulate ride sharing. There is a high degree of consistency, and I think to the credit of the board's bylaw here is more or less consistent with bylaws that have been passed to regulate ride sharing across Ontario to date. Where a driver and or vehicle is compliant with a bylaw in another city, yes, that driver could. So for example, this morning, let's hypothetically pretend I wanted to take an Uber from my home in Toronto to Brampton. Brampton doesn't have a bylaw to regulate ride sharing currently. Could I take a trip from Toronto to Brampton, although let's assume that driver lives in Toronto as well? Yes. Could that driver, let's say he or she has a vehicle that is let's say 8 years of age. Toronto's bylaw says you cannot have a vehicle more than 7 years of age. That driver, our technology would never send that trip request to that driver. They'd be geofenced or blacked out of Toronto because their vehicle doesn't meet the Toronto bylaw requirements. But if I was in Brampton, where there isn't a bylaw, or I was in Waterloo Region, where it's 10-year maximum vehicle age limit, that vehicle of 8 years, if that driver happened to be in Waterloo that day and compliant with the Waterloo bylaw, again, the audit-based model, most audit-based models don't license drivers. They only license the TNC, so there is no driver TNC license. Niagara's a little bit different in that respect. Could that driver pick up in Waterloo? Because yeah, they could. So there is, and I think one of the beauties, and I'm being long-winded, so I apologize, and I'll wrap up very shortly, like in 10 seconds, is the beauty of that transportation model is that consumers, you know, the regular folks in Niagara region, or any region, frankly, don't see municipal boundaries. They just need to go from A to B, and they appreciate that seamless nature of transportation that takes them where they need to go from A to B.
Okay, but just further to my question, I guess where I was going with it was not the fact of somebody wishing to pick up an Uber ride in Hamilton to take them to St. Catharines in another municipality. What I was more interested in is if they are indeed licensed, so that if you have licensed somebody who lives in Toronto and they decide they're going to come to Niagara Falls for the weekend and Uber drive all weekend down here and then go back to Toronto Sunday night. I'm just wondering how the connection is with the knowledge of our people versus where they're licensed, and even if they meet all the criteria, are they indeed licensed to be in Niagara?
Through you, Mr. Chair, thank you. I understand your question more clearly now. So the answer would be no. Right now, under the bylaw, whether I like it or not, the licensing unit has the final say to license a driver. So that driver coming from Toronto, it's always, no matter which municipality you're in, you're always allowed to drop off a rider in a municipality. But that driver, let's assume I took a trip from Toronto and the driver's licensed in Toronto, he's allowed to pick me up as a PTC or TNC driver in Toronto, and say I put in the app, I want to go to Niagara Falls today. Conceivably, yeah, that's possible. That driver could drive me from Toronto because they're licensed, they pick me up in Toronto. They get to Niagara Falls, he's or she's allowed to drop me off. The technology would prevent that person from getting a pickup in the Niagara region geographic jurisdiction. If the driver drove out of that jurisdiction into a neighboring municipality without a bylaw, for example, that wasn't covered in the Niagara region geographic boundary, could they pick up a ride request? Absolutely. But the technology would never send them a trip request in Niagara because they haven't been licensed by the unit here.
Member Marshall.
Thank you, Chair, and through you to Sergeant Levon. Have we got a summary of the P&L for the Uber business?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Sorry, Member Marshall, I didn't hear the entirety of that question. Do we have a summary of
the profit and loss? I'm not sure now. We've been operating for a year, and I don't know whether it has cost us money or whether there has been a surplus from the Uber operation.
Yes, that was actually, I believe I covered that in my report, but if I missed something, it's definitely cost us more than we have recouped from the TNC portfolio overall, which right now is only comprised of Uber.
And I'm sorry, because I've read through this thing and I can't find it, so I'm probably being slightly blind. Can you find it and tell us what that number is?
Detective Lindsay and one of our civilian staff did the analysis last year of the percentage of unit costs versus revenue.
Detective LeBon, do you want to answer that question in the next report?
Sure.
Okay, because you're going to be talking about the whole report. Is that okay with you, Member Marshall? Okay. Any other questions for the presenter? Member Bonham.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and through you. Chris, thanks for your presentation. Your proposal with regard, firstly, I understand quite clearly startup costs are anomalous and hopefully not going to be repetitive, and that lends itself to probably part of the reasons why we're not cost positive after the first year of operations. That being said, I'm from the private sector, and have never been a fan of having to set up a bureaucracy to certify your compliance. I think it's a cost that can never be borne by somebody who's drawing a service from somebody else. So my spin on your audit is kind of positive. However, I want to have you understand that if this board should consider going to an audit, that would mean that you would be self-certifying. And that's a standard and a bar that's pretty high. You'd have to be in the business of certifying that your people are in compliance with the bylaw at every reasonable period of time. I don't think 100% compliance at every moment of the day, month, and year is reasonable, but some derivation thereof. And given that self-certification may be on the table, it would have to be understood between the parties that should there be substantial problems found, that the penalties, therefore, would also be substantial. It wouldn't be a slap on the wrist, that there'd be some significant interruption in your business in the Niagara region as a consequence of you taking on self-certification and not being able to deliver that. I'd like your response to that. Would you understand that to be one of your risks, so to speak, of wanting this board to consider self-certification? Thank you.
Through you, Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. I think it's you know, if I was a board member, I think I'd ask the same question, so I appreciate it. A couple things I'll say. There are bylaws, a few of them, and I'm happy to give Mr. McKeag, board solicitor, copies of those, although he probably has them himself, where there is a, if you like, to borrow your phrase, a self-certification sort of provision. But I will also point out, and I think to maybe largely, although I can't surmise to Mr. McKeag's credit, is that the current bylaw, as it's drafted, again, I've provided, as you know, what I think are minor cosmetic changes to achieve, because the bylaw is actually pretty good. It incorporates, as you know, at Section 29, audit, the ability for the licensing unit to already audit. That's in the bylaw already. I'll point you, that's at Section 29. At Section 29.3 of the current bylaw, the issuer may, so I guess the licensing unit in effect, may in his sole discretion suspend a T&C license in circumstances such as A, the issuer reasonably believes that the T&C is permitting drivers to access its platform contrary to the provisions of this bylaw. So in effect, although we can make it clearer, perhaps through the board solicitor's wordsmithing, if you like, but that, in effect, is there already. Our ability to operate and continue to operate in the Niagara region, as it is in the case of Waterloo region, Ottawa, Toronto, frankly, all Oakville, you name it, is contingent on us ensuring that only drivers and vehicles that meet the requirements of a bylaw, be it Niagara region or otherwise, have access to the platform. If through an audit, if through a spot inspection, where the licensing unit's team takes rides on the platform and, again, would look at the data we provide on a daily basis, and that would include the driver's name, the license number, the date of in-vehicle inspection, the safety certificate, all the information on that document, all the information with respect to the motor vehicle reference check, the fact that a criminal background check was run and they're clear, all of that provided it can be on a daily basis. They'd be able to book a ride and cross-tabulate between, hey, this driver is not on that list, and if not, why, or take, if there's, I'm using a hypothetical example, 1,000 Uber drivers driving about 5 to 10 hours a week in the Niagara region, draw a scientific sample from that list, so you can get an accuracy within, 98, 99% without having to audit all drivers, and run a sample, and if we're found to be non-compliant, there are already in the bylaw, it's a very good bylaw, provisions that for penalties for noncompliance, with the ultimate penalty being the removal of our license. And then, of course, you would know, and I think Mr. McKay could speak more to it, is if, hypothetically, and we wouldn't, but hypothetically, if a T&C, could be any T&C, continued to operate after their license was withdrawn, a court very swiftly, I would imagine, would grant an injunction to stop that, and none of us, including myself, I may be too pretty for jail, want to go to jail, and that injunction would be forced and the T&C would be shut down. there is strong abilities in the bylaw already to do what I'm contemplating that the board consider already.
Okay, any other, Member Marshall.
Just one quick question. Uber has already demonstrated an ability to flout the law. So in case that you point out, if we were to suspend the operation, you just continue to do business the way you did when you first came into the Niagara Peninsula.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I appreciate where your question's coming from. It's a question I would ask as well. What I can tell you is this. Two examples. So if we just rewind time very quickly to about 3 years ago when the ride-sharing UberX service that's now licensed in Niagara region and other municipalities, when that was introduced by Uber in Canada, in Ontario, there were no bylaws at the time anywhere in Ontario that spoke to ride-sharing. They talked about taxi and limousine, but not this new TNC entity. City of Toronto at the time, you may recall, sought an injunction to prevent TNCs, Uber or otherwise, from offering that ride-sharing service. In a nutshell, the court decided against the City of Toronto and said, in a nutshell, hey, there's this new thing out there, your bylaws that were drafted years, decades before this new thing called TNCs, ride-sharing, existed. I'm telling you as a court, we need you to go back, redraft your bylaw to include that. If companies like Uber or other companies don't follow the bylaw, then come back and see us for an injunction. I can point to the second example, Calgary. Calgary sought an injunction against our provision of activity there. The courts granted the injunction, Uber shut down. So we have a very strong impetus when a bylaw recognizes the reality of our business. Before, bylaws only talked about taxi and limousine, not what we were doing. Now that your bylaw recognizes the reality of that, of an existence of a new category of ground transportation, there's penalties in that with the ultimate removal of our license to operate. We've shown repeatedly when a bylaw recognizes our reality, and yours does, and we would stop operating if we lose our license because there are real penalties then. Before, when bylaws didn't recognize ride sharing, courts generally, and there's more instances of courts finding against cities and not granting an injunction. I can tell you now, and I'm giving you a bit of my own personal legal opinion as a lawyer as well, Mr. McKaig might be able to give you more as well, is that injunctions are much more likely to be granted when a bylaw recognizes the reality of a business. And I'm using just the Toronto injunction as precedent here. And in Calgary, we ceased business in Calgary until a new bylaw was introduced in Calgary that recognizes the reality of ride sharing, and we operate under a bylaw in Calgary, a new bylaw, if you like, today.
Okay, seeing no other questions, I want to thank you for the presentation, Mr. Schaefer. As you know, as a police board, whether it's taxis or whether it's Uber and that, our number one concern is safety in the community. And plus, and I'll credit Member Ganzel, anything we do, we have to also look at the tax company. I'm not saying it because you're here, it's his idea, but we have to make sure it's fair to them and to you, be it records checks and things like this on it. As far as an audit and the decals and things like this, I have my own opinions on this, but as a board here, Deb wrote this up for me, but there's a motion I'd like to see moved, but to allow anybody to change it, that the presentation and information be received, and further that the recommendations be considered as part of the TNC review process at the next committee meeting September 13th. The reason September 14th. The reason I don't want to dwell on this, we look at rates, we look at things like this. I'd like to have us discuss this at September 14th and come up with a plan on it by then. So I'd like to know if there's a mover of that motion and a seconder. Member Ganzel, Member Stewart. Any comments or questions on that motion? Sorry, I'm going to screw you guys' names up all the time. All those in favor? Carried. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, the next report is the TNC review by Detective Sergeant LeBon. Item number 5. Can I have a mover and seconder to put this on the floor, please? Member Marshall, Member Ganzel. Detective Sergeant LeBon, do you want to speak to this, or we've got it in our hands?
Through you, Mr. Chair.
Member Marshall had a question that I think should be addressed on the losses, or whatever you want to say, the profit and loss on the Uber activities or TNC activities. If you can address that, please, in what you say.
Definitely, Mr. Chair, through you, Mr. Chair, to Member Marshall. With respect to the financial aspect, I looked at the annual fees. Right now, what we receive there's one annual fee for the TNC broker license, basically, the company license, and then there's trip fees of 11 cents per trip. And at the time that I had compiled this report, that came out to a total of, actually, it was just under, it was in the 37,000, I believe I put in here. I'm just going to find my stats. The $7,500 for the annual fee, and then we had recouped just over 29,000 in trip fees up to the point. We have one more check. So right now we have a total of just over $40,000 since the inception of Uber last year. I can't speak to the direct fees because, again, a lot of it was startup costs and legal costs in the beginning. However, when we looked at our percentages last year, we approximated 20% of our unit was being utilized on TNC, the TNC portfolio, which of course at this time is solely Uber, and only 3% of our revenue was coming from that portfolio. So there's where the large discrepancy is. Based on the finance department's forecast for the budget, the unit will cost altogether $741,000. 20% of that would be $148,000. I put these numbers together based on Laura Rouleau's report. That's 20%. Uber's currently paying, like I said, $40,000. So there's a $108,000 discrepancy if we use the percentages. The proposal that I've put in this, or at least something for the board to consider with respect to the numbers, falls in line more with considering what Hamilton and London have put forward for their numbers. And it could be anything, in discussions with the board and with our solicitor, it could be anything in between those. But it would be more in line if we had a $50,000 annual fee for that size of TNC license based on the number of drivers, and then the trip fees would average, right now we're averaging $32,000, and then nominal driver fees of $28,000, that could bring us up to $110,000 total, which would bring us right in line with being revenue neutral. Because we also can attest to the fact that if we went to the system, basically brought the TNC portfolio back to our normal system, we could cut our unit expenses, or at least when I say expenses, time spent, by approximately 50%. We could actually decrease the time we are spending on this portfolio right now, and we believe we could decrease it by approximately 50%, because a lot of the stuff that we're doing, we're duplicating time with two personnel, whereas if they came in like other licensees, it's a swipe of a driver's license, they show their information, and everything's created immediately.
Marshall, do you want to you have the floor if you wish.
Yeah, it's important with your department that we assign the costs to where they belong. We don't want to be charging the tow truck operations for the taxi costs. And so I would ask that you sit down with Laura and or Lisa again and do an analysis of the various licensing operations so that we can figure out where these costs belong. Thank you.
Member Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you. When you mentioned, a lot of the time spent, and I know some of it will be startup to be fair to Uber. You talk about all the time spent. Well, the department hasn't grown in size or whatever it is, so does this mean, and I guess my fear is that if we're spending all that extra time on the paperwork and everything, that maybe the enforcement isn't being done enough? Like, in other words, where does the time come from is where I'm really getting at, and what's being left out because of it?
Through you, Mr. Chair, you are 100% correct. The ability for my unit to provide enforcement has been directly impacted by the administrative avenues that we are forced to take with this portfolio.
And just following on that, I would certainly defer to Member Ganzel as far as technology goes, but I do know a little bit, and it seems to me that there has to be a way for Uber and Niagara to be able to connect with data. I mean, I know in various programs I use, you can export files in all kinds of various formats, and data is data. It's just a matter of making it line up. And I'm wondering if the licensing unit is willing to work, maybe with some tech people involved here, obviously, to say, here's the kind of format we need so that you can download a file and you can input it into your licensing, which I think is going to make more efficient. So somewhere this 20% time versus 3% money can somehow collide in the middle would make a lot of sense to me. And I'm just curious as to whether you see that as viable in the licensing department to get together to say, can we make this more efficient so we can bridge the gap, is what I'm saying. And I think most gaps get bridged by both sides moving, not just one side. Do you see that as a possibility?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I would love to explore that. To me, I don't understand, or at least I'm not sure how we can bridge that gap. I think Mr. McCaig already brought that up with Mr. Schaefer, and it sounded like they're willing to explore it, and so are we, if there's a solution. I don't know how, because right now the information has to be sent on a secure server to protect the information, and then we have to have our IT people download that information, make it available to us, and then we can input it into our system, and any further information back goes on a secure server. So I'm always willing to explore. Yeah. No doubt about that.
Well, I'm just thinking, though, I'm trying to provide the initiative here to say that, somehow between the technical people, because I realize Mr. Schaefer is not the technical person working there, and the technical people here, they speak the same language. It's the kind of language that Member Ganzel speaks, and some of us don't understand all the time. But nonetheless, those two people can speak the language, and maybe it's quite as simple as deciding what kind of file it has to be so it can directly upload versus, sitting here and, getting an Excel spreadsheet that turns around and just means a whole lot of data entry, because that takes time. In the world of technology, you should be able to input data once, and it should be able to be moved around and altered in formats so that it fits. I'd really like to see us explore that. I think it would show the board trying to meet halfway in reducing costs. And from Uber's point of view, and I know you're not on the stand anymore, Mr. Schaefer, or at the podium, but I think Uber could show a lot of good faith in saying, hey, how can we take our data and make the formats match up so we can export it to you in a format that works from the same data, and even having different formats for different places should be able to work. I can go in my spreadsheet and I can save it out in various forms for even other companies' stuff. Programs are built to do that. I'm sure that could happen if both sides are willing to get together, and it's the technical people that have to talk that, not me. So anyway, I hope that we can look at that as a possibility to be more efficient. Thank you.
Member Ganzel.
Thank you. Just a comment on this, and I look at it more as a direction through the chief's office. If we could have Mr. School's group sit down with Mr. Schaefer possibly somewhere in the next 2 months and try to hammer out, I'm assuming that Akram already has, but maybe another run at it, see if we can't get something that's more electronically cohesive between the two systems, and see if we can't get this to work. We've got to eliminate manual entry in every area as possible. So I'm sure Akram's looked at it. If we could just have another run at it.
Well, we can certainly connect Akram with the licensing office and with Mr. Schaefer, and they can work on that together.
Okay. Member Bonham.
No, thank you, Chair. Thank you for the report, Craig. And what I take away from it is that there's a lot of information in the system that's not consistent. And what you point out is that the information, I believe, coming from Uber is inconsistent with our information. They don't drive a lot of the time in terms of driver approvals, and who's approved, who's not approved, and all that kind of stuff. And certainly, I think we all appreciate that's a shifting landscape, possibly day to day, and based upon issues that drivers may or may not have external to the business. My concern is that when we have an issue wherein our own numbers aren't consistent, and I don't know how that would happen. And I'm not saying this just to be, you know, upstanding or outstanding or anything like that, but on page 3, in the second paragraph, I'm noting that it's under submissions and the difficulties of tracking people on and off, I guess. It's the second, or the last sentence says, as of June the 12th, 2017, we have processed and approved 1,481 Uber drivers. So I get that. Then I go down three paragraphs later, and it says that on June the 12th, Uber sent us an update master list, which said there are 1,408 drivers on their platform. So we've approved 1,481. Uber has 1,408 drivers on their platform. So obviously there's some people that have gone missing or they've excluded and haven't told us about. I get that. But the very next sentence gives me pause. That says our numbers showed 1,421 approved. So my question is, have there been 1,481 Uber drivers approved, or are the 1,421 drivers approved? And why the discrepancy in our own internal numbers? Thank you.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair. That's a great question. It could be a typo, and you know what? I apologize if that's the case. The problem was we were going back and forth at the time because there were two discrepancies. First, Uber had more people on their master list than we had approved, and then it was the opposite. They had less on their, so it very well could be a typo, and I apologize.
Yeah, no apology necessary. All I'm getting out of this is there's a heck of a chase for information, formats aside, and to keep them current. And I'm just concerned that we may internally not be able to keep track of our own numbers, and not trying to grandstand or anything, but it could very well be a typo, but perhaps there's something else in here that's made a difference between 1481 and 1421 in our own records that I'm not understanding, and perhaps you are, so that's why I asked the question. Thank you.
Okay, so no more. If there's no more questions, then Deb has a motion she's going to read, and then I'd like to see if there would be a mover and seconder to it, and then I'd like to speak to it first, because I want to put this to bed on September 14th if we can. Go ahead, Deb.
The motion is that the information be received, and further that the report be referred to the board solicitor and the issuer of licenses for review and report back with recommendations at the next committee meeting.
Do I have a mover? Member Marshall, Member Stewart to second it, and I'll just speak to it. We've just like the towing company, we want to put these things to bed on September 14th. So I'm asking you, Detective Sergeant LeBon, if we can have a meeting the first week of September or thereabouts, because you're going to have a month here, or really a month and a half to consider this. But to you, myself as chair of licensing, and any other members that want to be there, a conversation after you've talked to Uber, you've looked at all these avenues, because I have my own opinions on the decals. After listening about the decals, I'm not in favor of the decals, but I'll defer to make that decision down the way, because I see the problems with somebody just making up a decal on these things. And as far as auditing, I want to make sure that we're fair to the taxis as well as to Uber, that we're even playing field and all these things. But I want to have an answer on September 14th if we can. Any other comments on the motion? All those in favor? Carried. Thank you, Mr. Schaefer. And so now we'll move on to new business, and that is the man who said he wanted to speak. Are you Mr. Bogdanovic? Yes. Okay, thank you. Sorry for the delay, but again, I don't know what you're talking about. Well, I wasn't prepared for you. So you have 10 minutes, sir, if you want. It's Dalibor Bogdanovic from Niagara Falls Taxi. Thank you very much.
Okay. Okay. Good morning to the board members and to the licensing. Oh, yeah, okay. So good morning to everybody. The main reason here why we gather here, this group, and some people are not here, is the petition. Thank you. It's the petition about the decision that we made, that the board made last year about open region plates. So I'm going to read this petition first, then the second part I'm going to explain what we're going to talk about. So this letter is sent on behalf of taxi cab drivers throughout the Niagara region regarding issues surrounding both taxi cab drivers as well as their customers. Since the last year decision to open region, there have been a number of problems that affect drivers to properly operate and serve their purpose. So these issues consist of the taxi cabs condensing in one spot and leaving neighboring towns uncovered, creating longer wait times for the customers and slow to no response from on-duty drivers. For example, during the tourist season, all the drivers from Fort Erie, Port Colborne, Welland, and St. Catharines gather in Niagara Falls, pursuing tourists, thus leaving their cities without enough cabs to cover the demand, creating wait times that range from 30 minutes to a few hours. This also uncovers a bad reaction as not only to the jobs in the condensed area are split over twice the cars, but drivers refuse to go to unattended out of towns due to distance and usually prefer to book off and wait for pickups. This is also true for the wheelchair accessible vehicles, which are prohibited to refuse accessible jobs from dispatch. The same scenario can also be seen during the winter season in reverse, as majority of cabs focus on St. Catharines for the students, again, creating uncovered zones throughout the region. In a result of the above said, customers turn in search of alternatives, some of which are illegal, such as speedy. This is a big issue, and we believe that the region should be closed and every city should have their designated taxi cabs. This way, there will be always available cars in all areas that can respond in a timely manner with much less delays and without promoting illegal alternatives to the unhappy customers. We strongly believe that region should be closed, but another effective solution would be to isolate or separate Niagara Falls from the rest of the open region if neighboring cities benefit from it. Niagara Falls, as a tourist city, has already been assigned a proper ratio of available cabs to cover demand during on and off season. The separation of the city from the rest of the open region would help eliminate the problematic condensation that occurs and offsets the balance in the region. We hope that this letter gives you an insight of occurring open region issues, and we believe it would help you to make the right decision for the future, sincerely. So we're going to leave this with you guys, if you don't mind. So the second part, the team of people from Niagara Falls Taxi did a little bit of research for the driving under the influence charges before the region was open and after. So we used we done two statistical research analysis. So we used statistics information from the official Niagara Regional Police website. So we used several different comparable variables were used in both researches. So the first one was the pilot research, which focused only on 20 days in similar time of the year before and after. So that was the pilot one that we just tried to see if there is any difference or increase or decrease in driving under the influence charges. So, so what happened here, we used variable of residence of the charged individual. So we looked where they were from, so it can give us approximate idea what was happening before and after the decision of open region. So critical areas, it's a definition of the cities that that had problems with the taxi service before, so including Fort Erie, Pelham, Niagara-on-the-Lake, Port Colborne, Grimsby. So those are the critical areas, and they are defined within those cities that we look, the numbers that were increasing or decreasing. So if changed before and after the bylaw was applied, so the first analysis, as I mentioned, was a smaller random pilot sample. We see overall increase, so for the same, because that was available on the regional police website, it was very similar, so it was 20 days period in the wintertime, excluding New Year's Eve, which affects maybe going to increase. So we excluded something like a long weekends. So we had the increase from 24 charges to 32 after the open region bylaw. And critical areas affected from Fort Erie, Grimsby, Lincoln, Pelham, and Niagara-on-the-Lake jumped from 6 charges to 11. So there was almost double that jumped after the decision. So the second statistical analysis that we did was 2 months, so 60 days of analysis, and was done so with before 2016 July, if I'm correct. If not, you can correct me. We had 68 charges for 60 days from that was December 21st until February 21st, 2015 until February 21st, 2016, before the bylaw change. So there was 68 charges. Then we used, because we didn't have information, we used different statistical samples from after the decision, which instead of 60 days, we could do only 62 days. So it's a slight difference of 2 days, but the change in charges jumped from 68 to 109. So, and what was happening here, increase after regional plates are introduced, almost also showing as double. And what was happening here, the critical change was Dunville, Winefleet, Fort Erie, Niagara-on-the-Lake, Pelham, Thorold, Grimsby. 67 out of 109 charges after the decision were out of those municipalities. So that's, everything is here, documented. So we just want to present this. Is there any way that we can mention something about Uber or no at this point?
Don't slander them, but if it's a fact-based comment,
if you can move this PowerPoint that right now, because I'm just looking at that all the time, and we are talking about something else, guys. I don't know. It's an Uber PowerPoint. I don't want to see that over there. Yeah. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. I can do it. That's okay. There we go. So, thank you. So, that would be our main point about the whole changes. So, we would like you to reconsider the decision that you made last year and take statistics in consideration about your decision, because this was a pilot program for 1 year, so you're going to...
Okay, so you've made some interesting points there, and I'll allow the board to ask you questions, but I'm going to ask Detective LeBlanc. I'm not trying to put you on the spot,
okay.
But we're going to consider his points in that. And do you have any responses right now, or he's just gotten up? I get it.
Through you, Mr. Chair, yeah, I was unaware of any of this, so I would appreciate some time to actually digest it and actually get a copy of these statistics and where they were derived from.
So I'll be asking the board solicitor to speak as well on this, but if you can meet with him and his crew over the next while, I appreciate you standing up for this. Deb needs copies of what you've said, so you're willing to give it
Yeah,
to her.
but if I can photocopy this, I can give it to you. But
you got it. Deb will talk to you as soon as we're done here. Please stay there for a second. Woody, if you have any questions.
If I can just ask a question.
By all means, you can ask them.
If I understand you correctly, sir, on this issue of the region-wide use of licenses, you're saying that in the smaller communities, specifically not Niagara Falls or St. Catharines, the cabs are leaving there and going to Niagara Falls and or St. Catharines, and so there's less service in the outlying areas. That's one point.
Yes, sir.
And the second point is that from those outlying areas, the study that you've done shows that impaired driving charges have gone up in those areas.
Yes.
And you feel there's a link between those two points.
There are also other variables that I didn't include, so they maybe they influence too. So it's not.
I just want to make sure I understood your points. And
this is the point. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, sir.
Any other questions from the board? Okay, Detective LeBlanc, when you come out with your report, I'd like to know if drivers not attending people's places, just flat out saying no to the outlying areas or wherever it is. Plus, you made a comment that wheelchair accessible vehicles are not responding as well. Yes. I'd like you to take a look at this stuff, if this is true, and if there's any complaints regarding the taxi or Uber service or anything like this, and that a full report on it if we can to talk about for our next meeting if we can. And how did we leave this when we changed the things with the taxi drivers and that a year ago? Were we reviewing that now, or what was the date?
It was a one-year trial. I think it's up now.
Up now.
July,
Okay,
yeah.
so this makes good for
Perfect
us to
timing,
review
yep.
the whole thing. So, Member Marshall, you have a question?
Yes, excuse me. How many taxi companies do you represent now? Is it just Niagara Falls?
I represent Niagara Falls Taxi. It's also some people from Central Taxi here that were involved in a petition.
This is one of the concerns that we had at the time when we changed the bylaw, that the country, if I can use that term, the country, cities would not do well in terms of coverage. But I would like to make sure that you represent the majority of the taxi companies that feel this way in the peninsula. And I guess that's up to Detective Laban to sort out. Thank you.
Member Bonham.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. Your linkage between more DUI charges in the rural communities after the change was made to go region-wide versus before, I'd be very concerned with regard to the frequency of sampling. Like, the more often we look, the more problems we find, right? So I don't know if we're looking more often or looking at more drivers after we went to region-wide in these rural jurisdictions or not, but I think we got to be very careful about how we interpret the statistics, take out any variables that would tend to sway the numbers one way or another so that the analysis is cleaner, so to speak. And I just throw that out as a caution. It's not about the absolute numbers. It's about what percentage of sampling do we do? How often did we do it before versus after? Are they skewing the information? And if so, how do we eliminate the skewing impact? Thank you.
Can I just respond to that? So, with all due respect, with the undergrad and grad degree in sociology and criminal justice, doing a lot of statistical work at University of Guelph, working over there as a TA for 2 years. I think this research needs more improvement. So I agree with you that it's always something else that you can include, and the sample can be bigger. The bigger a sample, it gives you more precise outcome for particular research. So thank you.
So thank you for that. The one thing with our review, we'll be listening to drivers from St. Catharines and other areas as well. So if anybody watching this or whatever, we're going to do a review on everything that we've done with regards to taxis. So we'll invite that for Detective Laban when he meets with everyone on this. So if you come up with any ideas, especially things that we haven't addressed, it's time to change them too if we have to, just like the towing company said about cleanups and that. If there's something we haven't addressed, it's time to hit it, because we don't want to hit it all the time, but we said we would review it after a year, so let's do it. So thank you for that. Can I have a mover and seconder to receive his, Mr. Bogdanovic's?
Is it, I apologize, only one more request. There is one person that want to talk. Is that possible? I don't know. I'm just, I'm asking.
I have a problem if it goes one more and goes one more and it's going one more. So at the start, I said one person. So I'm sorry. If that person wants to give their opinions to Detective Laban when he meets with them, that's fine. But again, I'm not trying to be rude, but I have to control this meeting. So can I have a mover and seconder on this, please? Member Caslin, Member Bonham, all those in favor of receiving this? Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Board. Okay. Thank you, officers.
So is there any other new business for the licensing meeting? I see none. This meeting's adjourned. Thank you. Next will be the IT meeting. And that'll be at 12:30. Thank you.